Not everybody knows the story of Willy the Wisp, a strange phenomenon that used to occur here years ago. It was a flash of light that went through the boglands of Mullaban, caused by the ignition of methane gas being produced by the boglands. But I'm going to tell you the real story of Willy the Wisp. And Willy was a blacksmith, and a great blacksmith he was, and people came from miles around to get horses shod and to get ploughs repaired. And with the increase of work, Willy had an increase in funds, and he soon discovered shebeens and drinking houses around the country. And he used to take himself off in the middle of the day sometimes, and he'd leave his men standing in the middle of the forge waiting for their horses to be shod and their ploughs to be repaired, and there'd be no sign of Willy. But like that, it reflected on his work, and soon after time people started to leave Willy and go elsewhere to get their horses shod and their ploughs repaired. Until one day Willy was sitting in the bar and he had run out of money and he was refused any more drink. And with that plight he thought to himself, what am I to do? But he knew of a woman up in Forkhill that was versed in the art of black magic. And he mustered up the courage one evening and he went up and he called with her and he told her his plight, and she told him exactly what to do. She says, Willy, if you're brave enough, she says, take yourself off to a four-forked crossroads, she says, on the eve of Halloween. And she handed him a little sack of lead balls. And she says, on the stroke of 10 to 12, she says, go around with them balls and place them out at every point on the crossroads. And at a minute to 12, she says, the devil will appear to you and you can ask him for whatever you like. Well, that was a tall order for Willy, but he had very little option. And he took the lead balls off the woman and he came home and he waited on Halloween Eve. And there he was walking towards Drumgoody Crossroads, the four-forked crossroads, where he intended in placing the little lead balls out. And at 10 to 12 he started the act, and around he went. And on the stroke of 12, what happened? Only the devil appeared to him and said, Willy, you have summoned me. And Willy says, I have. And he told him his plight. And the devil agreed that Willy would go home tonight, and in the morning when he would waken, the house would be full of money and he could do whatever he liked. But there was a condition. There's always a condition. And the condition was that the devil would be back for Willy's body and soul in 7 years. And so Willy thought to himself, 7 years is a lifetime away. He says, I'll take me chances. And he shook hands with the devil and away he went. And that night he went home and he climbed into the bed and he tossed and he turned until he couldn't sleep with pure excitement. But eventually he did fall asleep and off into a dream he fell. And when he awoke from the dream, he went down the stairs and opened up the scullery door, and there was every shelf in the scullery laden down with the weight of money. While Willy was rubbing his hands again, he was back in business. And off to the shebeens and the public houses he took himself again, and his friends looked at him in astonishment, wondering how is he doing it. But the 7 years went by fairly quick, and about a week before the end of that term, Willy happened to be sitting in the forge, and all of a sudden the door busted open and an old man came throttling in and fell down face first on the forge floor. And Willy was kind-hearted and he wasn't going to have a man dying on his forge like that. So he lit the fire and he made some soup and he mended the man. And then when the man was well enough to know that he was mended, he says, Willy, that was a very admirable thing you done for me, he says. You saved my life. And he says, and for doing that, he says, I'm going to grant you 3 wishes. I have the power to do that, he says. And he said it in an old ancient voice. And more out of humour than the old man, Willy thought to himself, well, he says, the first thing I wish for, he says, is that any man that comes into this forge and sits in that rocking chair will sit there until I bid him rise. Granted, he says. And what's your second wish? He says, my second wish is, he says, that any man that I invite to strike the anvil with the sledge will do so until I bid him stop. And what's your third? He says, my third wish is, he says, that any coin that I put into this little check purse of mine, he says, will stay there no matter what happens. Granted, he says. And all in that, he says, you never wished for heaven. And at that, the old man turned around and he left. And for all the looking Willy could do, he couldn't see the old man anymore. And that week had passed until finally came the fateful night, and the knock comes to the door, and the door swings open, and there he is, standing in all his glory, the devil. "Willie, I have come for your soul." And Willie was there at the time making a pair of shoes for Joe McCreesh over on the Longfield Road, and he was tipping away, and he says, "Come on in," he says, "and let me finish these shoes." He says, "Joe's an awful busy man, and if I don't get these done for him, he'll be in an awful way." And in comes the devil and sits down in the rocking chair. Well, lads, the minute he sat down, he was captivated. And Willie took the sledge over and he beat the devil sitting in the chair until the devil cried out, "Stop," he says, "stop," he says, "I can take no more. I'll grant you another 7 years grace on earth." To which Willie agreed. And like that, them 7 years came and went fairly quick as well, until the final knock comes to the door again. And there he is, the devil in all his glory once more. And he says, "Willie, I'm back for your soul." And this time he came into the forge and he sidestepped the rocking chair. He wouldn't sit in it, for knowing if he did, he'd be captivated again. And this time he stood over beside Willie, and Willie was there at the anvil hammering away. And she says, "Sure, maybe you'd like an old swing of the hammer yourself," he says. And the devil grabbed the hammer, and the minute he grabbed it, the arm started to go like this, hammering and hammering and hammering on the anvil for hours, while the sweat was leaving him and the blood was leaving him, until he cried out, "Stop," he says, "stop," he says, "I can take no more," he says. "I'll grant you another 7 years grace on earth." To which Willie agreed. And at that the devil left. And ladies and gentlemen, them 7 years seemed to go fairly quick as well, until the final night that the knock comes to the door, and Willie's sitting in the forge, and the door comes open, and outside the forge stands the devil, and he didn't even come in this time. He says, "Willie, I'm growing very impatient with you," he says. "It's time you came with me now." And Willie was there, and he says to him, "You know," he says, "I think I'm ready to go. But," he says, "you know, before I go," he says, "I'd love one last drink." And the devil was that keen to get Willie's soul into hell, didn't he turn himself into a sovereign. And when the sovereign hit the floor, Willie went over and picked it up, and he took out his little check purse, and he put it into it, and he closed it up nice and tight, and he took it over to the anvil, and he lifted the sledge, and he beat the life out of it sitting on the anvil, until the devil cried out, "Stop," he says, "stop," he says. "I don't want you anymore," he says. "You can stay where you are." He says, "You're nothing but a poultice." And at that he got up and he walked out of the forge, and that was the end of the devil. And Willie lived his life out, and he lived a natural life, and when it came to the end, he died a natural death. And when he did die, he took a tear up the stairs to the gates of heaven. And there he was met with Peter at the gates, and Peter says, "Willie, I can't let you in here," he says, "on account of you selling your soul to the devil many, many years ago." And Willie says, "Well, what am I to do now?" He says, "Take yourself down to Porcatry there," he says, "and see how you fare out there." It was the same answer there, no entry. And there was Willie, looking at his last and final option. A big set of steel and stone steps that went down and around and down to the fiery pits of hell. He could hear the screams of the people down there. He could smell the flesh burning. But he had no option but to take himself down. And off Willie goes, down the steps, down and around and down, until he comes up again a lovely set of wrought iron gates. And Willie went over and he kicks the gate, and the gate rattles, and the devil jumps up at the chair and he says, "Who's there?" And Willie says, "Oh," he says, "it's Willie," he says, "your old mate." Well, the devil leapt at the chair, and he grabbed a big iron bar that was sitting, and he put it on the gates as not to let Willie into hell. He says, "If I let you in here," he says, "you'll kill all the devils in hell." And he turned around and he reached into the fiery pit, and he pulled out a whisper light. And through the bars of the gate he handed Willie the whisper light, and he says, "You return," he says, "to the boglands of Mullaban and roam them for eternity," he says, "for you're not getting in here." And on a night that's nice and quiet and still, you might just see the soul of Willy the Wisp going through the boglands of Mullaban. Thank you very much.